Post-colonial literature. An introduction to writings from South Africa. First, let's start to discuss the post-colonial literature. Post-colonial literature refers to stories and writings that explore the experiences, cultures, and effects of countries that were once colonized by other nations. Like post-colonial literature comes from Britain's former colonies in the Caribbean, Africa and India. Many post-colonial writers write in English and focus on common themes such as the struggle for independence, emigration, national identity, allegiance and childhood. Simple English definition: stories about what happens in places that were once ruled by other countries and how it affects the people who live there. Next is, what is South African literature? Imagine South Africa as a big garden with lots of different flowers. Each flower has its own color, shape, and story. Now, think of South African literature like a book that tells the stories of all these flowers. These stories can be told in English or Afrikaans, a special language that came from Dutch, and they're about everything happening in this big garden. Communities. South Africa is like a big family picnic with different families. Each family has its own food, games, and music. There are families that came from far away, like the Dutch and British, families that were always there, like the Nguni Sotho and Khoisan, and families that came to work, like the Indians. They all share this big picnic area, but sometimes they don't share very well. Colonization. Long ago, two big families from far away, the Dutch and then the British, decided they wanted to join the picnic. They brought their own food and games, but they didn't ask if they could join. They just started taking over the picnic area. This made it hard for the original families to enjoy their picnic. Themes, issues, and history. The stories from the South African garden are often about how these families didn't share the picnic area nicely. There were fights and some families tried to take away the toys and food from the others. These stories help us remember how important it is to share and listen to each other. Mefikin Difikane. Think of a time when one group of kids at the picnic started fighting over who gets the best spot. This made it really easy for another group to come in and take over while they were busy fighting. That's what happened in South Africa too. Xhosa cattle killing. Imagine if someone told you that if you give away all your toys, you'd get even better ones tomorrow. But then, tomorrow comes, and there are no new toys. This happened in South Africa with cows, and it was a very sad story because cows were very important to them. Colenso controversy. This is about a big argument on how to tell who's wrong and who's right when everyone is upset. It's like trying to solve a fight at the picnic over who knocked over the juice. The Great Trek. Imagine a group of families at the picnic deciding they don't like the rules, so they pack up their stuff and move to a different part of the garden to set their own rules. Anglo-Boer Wars. This is about two big fights over who gets to decide the rules at the picnic. It caused a lot of hurt and made the garden a sad place for a while. Enduring issues. Even after the big fights, there are still problems at the picnic. Some families don't have enough to eat or toys to play with. The stories tell us about these problems so we can try to fix them. Apartheid. Imagine the picnic area is divided with ropes, and some families are told they can only stay in a small corner and can't use the swings or slides. That was apartheid. It was unfair, and many stories are about how people felt and what they did to remove those ropes. Looking at a few texts. We read stories from this time to learn about the families, their feelings, and dreams. It helps us understand why sharing and kindness are so important. So, South African literature is like a big book of stories from the garden picnic, teaching us about sharing, being kind, and understanding each other better. South African stories are mostly about two big time periods. 1. Before the year 1960, it was mostly white people who talked a lot and felt very smart. Black people started to write stories too, and people began to notice how good they were. 2. After the year 1960, black writers started to shine a lot, becoming very important in telling stories. Even white writers started to say that treating people unfairly based on their color, apartheid, was very wrong. We talked a lot about what happened before 1960 and how it made people write certain stories. There was a very special magazine called Drum that came out in the 1950s. It was like a loudspeaker for black people in cities, talking about their lives and dreams. This magazine became super popular, even famous around the world, because it shared stories and problems of black and colored people in a place where not everyone treated each other nicely. It was like a treasure in places where people didn't have many books or magazines, and everyone wanted to read it. Reading the text. Nadine Gordimer, Julie's People. Nadine Gordimer was a very brave and talented writer from South Africa. She wrote many stories about how unfair and wrong it was to treat people differently because of their skin color, in a system called apartheid. She believed that everyone should be treated equally and used her stories to show the world how bad things were in South Africa. Nadine was born in a place where she saw a lot of unfairness from when she was very young. Her parents came from far away and taught her about being kind and fair to everyone. Even though she got sick and had to stay at home a lot, she read many books and started writing her own stories. She loved writing so much that she never stopped, even when she grew up. She wrote a book called Julie's People, which is about a world turned upside down, where the people who were once in charge are now being looked after by those who used to work for them. This story made some people very upset, but Nadine wanted to show that being unfair to others is never right. Nadine didn't just write stories, she also stood up for what she believed in. She went to protests and helped her friends who were in trouble for fighting against apartheid. She was a good friend to Nelson Mandela, who was a very important leader in fighting against unfairness in South Africa. Nadine stayed in South Africa because she loved her country and wanted to make it a better place. So, Nadine Gordimer used her writing to tell the world about how important it is to treat everyone fairly, no matter what. She showed that words can be very powerful in fighting against wrong and making the world a kinder place. Social configurations. Social configurations means the different ways people come together and interact in society. Simple English definition: how people meet, talk, and work together in their community. Apartheid and civil war in the text. In the story, there were people who were treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. This made them very sad and angry. They wanted things to change so that everyone could be treated the same. Sometimes, when people are treated badly for a long time, they get very upset, and there can be fights and disagreements. That's what happened in the story. Interregnum and locating power. In the story, there was a time of confusion and uncertainty. Things were changing, and nobody was sure who was in charge anymore. Some people who used to have power suddenly didn't, and others who were once not important became very important. It was like a big puzzle where no one knew where the pieces fit anymore. Relationship of Smails and July. There was a family called the Smails who needed help, and there was a man named July who helped them. July was very kind and smart, and he knew how to do many things. Even though the Smails were used to being in charge, they learned that July was just as important and sometimes even more helpful than they were. Rural versus the city binary. The Smails used to live in a big city with lots of buildings and cars, but then they moved to a small village far away. In the village, there were no big buildings or cars, and life was very different. Sometimes, people like living in big cities, and sometimes they like living in small villages. It's like having two different kinds of adventures. The bakkie and the gun. In the story, there was a special kind of truck called a bakkie, and there was also a gun. The bakkie was used to carry things and help people move from one place to another. The gun was a tool that some people used to protect themselves or to fight with. Sometimes, things that are supposed to help can also cause harm if they're not used carefully. Reading the dystopia. In the story, there were some parts that were not very nice. It showed a world where things were not fair and people were not kind to each other. This helps us understand that even though the story is made up, it can teach us about the real world and how important it is to be fair and kind to everyone. These sections might sound a bit tricky, but they're like pieces of a puzzle that fit together to make the whole story. Each part helps us understand a different aspect of the characters and the world they live in. Problematizing gender. Problematizing gender means questioning or challenging the traditional ideas about what it means to be a boy or a girl, or how boys and girls should behave. Simple English definition: thinking about and asking questions about whether boys and girls have to do certain things or act a certain way just because they are boys or girls. About the author. This is information about the person who wrote the story, like their name and maybe where they live. A short summary of Julie's People. This is a quick explanation of what happens in the story, Julie's People, like who the characters are and what they do. Julie's People is a story about a white family who must flee to the home of their black servant, July, when a civil war breaks out in their country. They face challenges adjusting to their new life in the village and navigating their relationships with July and his family. Locating the protagonist. This is finding out who the main character of the story is, like who the story is mostly about. The relationship of Maureen and July. This is about how two characters named Maureen and July feel about each other and what they do together, like if they are friends or family. The other woman, Ellen. This is about another character named Ellen who is important in the story, like what she does and how she feels. Maureen's marriage. This is about the relationship between Maureen and her husband, like if they love each other and if they are happy together. The white woman in a black village. This is about a woman named Maureen who is white and living in a village where most people are black, like how she feels being different from everyone else. A novel ending. This is about how the story finishes or ends, like if everything turns out okay or if there's a surprise at the end.